All right, today I'm going to be doing a refutation of Alexander Wong's speech about cigarettes and smoking. His main claim was that the federal government should prohibit the sale and purchase of cigarettes to the general public. His supporting claims were, number one, the effects of smoking on a person's well-being and its addictive nature is disagreeable to the general public. Number two, smoking is harmful fiscally as well. And number three, cigarette smoking is hammered into our heads and brainwashes children and pushes them into addiction. Alexander's main claim is actually a claim of policy. So what I did is kind of looked at the implied claim of fact that he was making here, basically that if smoking was outlawed, it would be effective in solving certain social, health, and fiscal issues that we have. Looking at the first secondary claim, the effects of smoking on a person's well-being and its addictive nature is disagreeable to the general public. I'm not sure that this is really a dispute. This is more kind of informative. There's been lots of studies about smoking and its harmful effects, and I don't think anyone would argue that smoking is a positive thing overall, that there's more negative effects than positive effects. So I don't think there's really much to argue on this point, so I'm going to move on to number two, which is that smoking is harmful fiscally as well. Alexander, the advocate, stated that approximately $96 billion is spent annually on healthcare costs. This was actually taken from a campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, which is an anti-smoking organization. There are other statistics that are a lot less than that, about $70 billion from the CDC. Also, he fails to take into account that if cigarettes were outlawed, there would be lost tax revenues, which help the economy, and also there would be lost jobs in the agriculture industry in growing tobacco and producing cigarettes. The claim number three, cigarette smoking is hammered into our heads and brainwashes children and pushes them into addiction. I think this has the fallacy of emotionally loaded language. I didn't see any proof in his speech that tobacco companies are actually capable of brainwashing children. He uses an explanation like, you see young people smoke, everybody knows teenagers smoke. The FTC said that in 2001 the tobacco industry spent about $8.24 billion to market tobacco, and he basically makes a connection that young people smoke and the tobacco industry spends a lot of money, therefore the advertising is brainwashing the children and making them smoke. And I think the advocate fails to really create a connection here between those two facts. In response to the claim overall, I wanted to present a parallel case, that of prohibition in the early 1900s. This is a time where the federal government outlawed drinking of alcoholic beverages. And I have a quote here from Mark Thornton, who's an assistant professor of economics at Auburn University, talking about prohibition. He said, although consumption of alcohol fell at the beginning of prohibition, it subsequently increased. Alcohol became more dangerous to consume, crime increased and became organized. The court and prison systems were stretched to the breaking point, and corruption of public officials was rampant. No measurable gains were made in productivity or reduced absenteeism. Prohibition removed a significant source of tax revenue and greatly increased government spending. It led many drinkers to switch to opium, marijuana, patent medicines, cocaine, and other dangerous substances that they would have likely been able to encounter in the absence of prohibition. I think looking at this parallel case, we can kind of see a correlation between drinking and smoking. They're both hazardous to your health. And when prohibition existed, when drinking of alcoholic beverages was illegal, it didn't really improve the situation, and that law was ultimately repealed. I think there's other alternatives to banning smoking altogether. One of them would be increasing taxes, which would, number one, increase tax revenues for the government and also reduce the amount of smoking. Prohibition ultimately led to an increase in expenditures for enforcement. It increased organized crime and had some other negative effects. So for that reason, I would say that the smoking ban would not be effective in solving those issues that were described in the advocate's speech.
All right. You list the proposition and the secondary claims pretty clearly. I think you're right that it's a policy claim, and I like the approach that you have, trying to infer what the factual claim is underneath that assumption, that this would in fact make a difference. The signpost on the first point is clear, and I think you're right, it's all just background information. There's not really any conflict on that. You sound silly trying to refute something that everybody accepts as being true, so go ahead and skip to the second point. On the second point about the cost estimates, at best you have some minimization. So what if it's not 96 billion, it's only 70 billion? Still sounds pretty substantial. I think what you need to do is talk about whether or not we could affect those costs at all by having a ban, or whether a ban is going to reduce it substantially. And at the end, when you come up with the disadvantage argument, there's some reasons to believe that there could be some potential problems there. Some of the other problems that you cite earlier, like unemployment and some other issues, I think are okay, but none of them are documented. They're all asserted at that point. The challenge on the third point basically is just a challenge to the causality on the spending. I think that's a pretty reasonable challenge. Anything that you could show, for instance, that shows that the number of kids who start smoking is gone down, or the number of total smokers has gone down, or that there are currently restrictions on advertising to children, which there are. I think that that would probably be helpful on this point. Maybe some counterclaims about the things that really encourage people to start smoking in the first place. It's less likely that it's got to do with advertising, more likely that it's got to do with peer pressure and social forces. Basically, at the end, you come down to the counterclaim that has to be considered because it is a policy argument, and that is what are the negative consequences of doing this. And you've got this one quote that I think is pretty thorough in trying to develop all the potential negative consequences, although it doesn't really develop in them very much. It just kind of lists all the bad things that happened when we had prohibition before. How parallel prohibition of alcohol would be to tobacco, I think, is a little bit up in the air. If we had a further debate on this, there might be some challenges on that point, but I thought that that was the right kind of strategy to use in this situation. All right, thank you.